And so I'm thrilled that you all could spend time with us. I think we have an agenda slide here that I'll just mention that we're going to get started with a STEAM panel talking about emerging career pathways. And then we'll have some time to share with one another updates related to pathways. I know I've been involved in a good chunk of these efforts, but I would really appreciate folks volunteering information about efforts that they're taking locally, and spread the word on those good efforts. And then we'll have a breakout, some time to talk more deeply about policy and how to advance pathways regionally. So the closer here is a very brief report out, so we can share with one another, and then we'll make this recording available to everybody as well, so you'll have a chance to review that. So without further ado, I think what I'll do is turn it over to Emily Raffel to kick us off with our panel today.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. And good to see so many folks joining. I know there's also an HLC meeting today, so I know a lot of folks we usually see on here are double booked, which is why we're recording. So I'm going to introduce our panel in just a second, but really encourage everyone, if they have questions for the panel, to put them in the chat throughout, and I'll keep my eye on it, and can ask your questions of them throughout the panel. And we can go ahead and get started. So Jeff, if you don't mind stopping your screen share so that they can see our panelists' faces. Perfect. So their full bios are in the briefing book that you should have received ahead of time. So I'm not going to read their full bios, but they're impressive. So I encourage you to check them out. But we are joined by Megan Andrew, who's a social behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation, Tabitha Colter, Director of Operations at the Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, and Rodney Petersen, Director of the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I'm just going to ask them each to start off by sharing a little bit about their work, and to sort of describe the current state of workforce development in their industry and how different stakeholders are engaged. So Rodney, I'd love for you to start off and give us just some background about your work and workforce development.
Great, thank you, and thanks everybody for being here today. I hope you're a little familiar with NIST, but if not, I'll start with a brief reminder that our focus is cybersecurity education, training, and workforce development. We're probably best known for the NIST framework, or the workforce framework for cybersecurity. And of course, being at NIST, a standards organization, it's fitting that we have developed what we think is a workforce standard that also applies to education and training, and also can be used by learners as they kind of chart out their career. We also are driven by a strategic plan, and that strategic plan was recently renewed and updated to include 3 goals that I think are relevant today. One is promoting career discovery, which is all about career pathways. Secondly, to transform the learning process, which includes a pretty clear focus on credentials. And then thirdly, to modernize talent management systems, which is really how employers consume that information as well. We do have other goals related to the NIST framework, as well as research that we want to encourage to be done about effective practices. But that's kind of a high-level overview of what we do.
Thanks, Rodney. Megan, do you want to chime in next?
Sure, let me come off of mute. My name is Megan Andrew. I'm a full social behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. That is a nonprofit think tank that you might be familiar with via their work with defense industries, some of which is relevant for the civilian advanced manufacturing sector that I'm going to talk about today. A lot of my research has been in post-secondary education, labor market dynamics. In the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, I have been heavily involved in research on career pathways in advanced manufacturing, technology adoption in advanced manufacturing, so on and so forth. 2 of my largest projects have been one in the Pittsburgh area, studying with a partner the sort of landscape or menu of education programs related to advanced manufacturing. I've also worked recently on a National Science Foundation project around barriers and facilitators for both employers and students in advanced manufacturing education and training programs. So I'm very excited to be here today. Credential transparency is obviously very important for a lot of the work I do, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Tabitha.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I work as Director of Operations for a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's known as Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, or PAVE. PAVE launched 3 years ago, and we're a coalition of members that include traditional automakers like Audi and Toyota, new automotive companies like Waymo and Zoox, and nonprofit organizations like the National Federation of the Blind and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So these members are all taking different technological approaches or tackling different social issues with transportation, and our mission is to unite that work around public education. We also have 2 different advisory councils of academics and public sector officials who keep us up to date in those areas and help provide input on how PAVE can best assist communication efforts in those areas with regards to autonomous vehicles. So our members believe, we risk missing out on those potential improvements to our transportation system, things in safety, mobility, equity, and sustainability, if the public isn't part of that conversation. So our mission is to try to help the public understand autonomous vehicle technology, ask their questions, share their concerns, and help bring that really wide range of diverse stakeholders to the table to make sure that we're, advancing the future of transportation to benefit all of us. So I'm really glad to be here and excited to be part of the conversation.
That's great. Thanks all of you for sharing a little bit of background about your work. And I'd love if you could each share just a little bit deeper, dig a little bit deeper onto maybe some trends, maybe even some challenges in your field or industry that you see better credential data helping to solve. And whoever wants to chime in first, feel free.
So I was trying to put a resource in the chat link, which you can see there. We partner with CompTIA and Burning Glass to create a website called cyberseek.org that talks about jobs in cybersecurity. And of course, it's aligned to the framework I described earlier, the NIST framework. And this week we updated our data that shows 600,000 open jobs in the United States. The beautiful thing about this tool, cyberseek.org, is you can research it by state, by metropolitan area. So in the Midwest, you could consolidate either across the region or look more locally. And we also added some new features like education and training providers, recognizing there's both community colleges, universities, but also training organizations that are helping to support this in-demand workforce. So, in general, at the same time that we saw the number of workers in cybersecurity increase to well over 1 million, the increase in demand is growing even bigger than the amount of people we're placing into cybersecurity jobs. Final thing I would say there, because I know it's something we talked together about as a panelist, we don't think of cybersecurity as an industry. Cybersecurity is needed by every industry, manufacturing, retail, IT. Just got off a meeting with industrial control systems that need cybersecurity for the control systems that run our water and building and other safety systems. And so when we're talking about cybersecurity jobs, we're talking about not only people who do IT, cybersecurity, but people who are lawyers, who are planners, who are auditors, who are crime investigators, and a variety of other roles in the economy that they play.
Thanks, Rodney.
I'd love to go next after Rodney, actually, because on that same point, I think with autonomous vehicles, one of the things that I find most fascinating about it is how interdisciplinary they are. So we're taking some of the most complicated problems in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then as, Rodney was sort of discussing, we're interweaving complicated problems also in philosophy, law, policy, sustainability, communications, you name it. So I think it's a really interesting part of working in the space of an emerging tech field is there's just this sense of kind of collective engagement and an understanding that education and future generations are going to be a really big part of that technology going forward. So a couple different trends I've kind of seen in the self-driving space are workforce development taking place in a lot of different directions. So as I mentioned with my work, I get to kind of interface with people across different sectors: industry, academia, public sector, advocacy. So I have a bunch of examples I could share across each of those, but just wanted to highlight a few. So one of the first I wanted to pull out when people talk about autonomous vehicles is a quote from a company I know developing fully autonomous vehicles. And they used a quote recently I'm going to borrow here, which was, "We're building cars to drive themselves, not fix or build themselves." And I think that's such an important idea when we're talking about the evolution of transportation and a workforce that has existed historically in this space and is going to continue to exist in the future for development, operation, maintenance. Those roles are going to likely look different than they have traditionally and are going to probably require new credentials, upskilling, different degree programs, but those roles are going to continue to exist when we think about what goes into building and maintaining those vehicles of the future. I've also spoken with a lot of academic institutions and public sector entities across the country who are also really invested and interested in that journey of preparing the next generation of workers. People at community colleges who are developing programs for mechanics for autonomous vehicles, state entities who are focusing on K-12 education for robotics, growing academic opportunities, internships, and degrees focused on the field. It's still very much an emerging field, so nobody quite has all the answers yet on what the credentials would be, what those programs are going to look like, but it's definitely not too late to start thinking about it and building on those foundations. Real quick, I know that was a lot, but I have one other quick point I wanted to make on fostering economic opportunities with autonomous vehicles and some really important group of stakeholders who are passionate about the outcome there. So access to convenient and reliable transportation is one of the most crucial pieces in reducing economic inequality. So individuals with access to vehicles are 4 times more likely to have a job. And when we think about that barrier of good quality on-demand transportation, it's also huge when it comes to communities of people with disabilities. So the Bureau of Transportation Statistics identified in 2018 that there are 25.5 million Americans with a travel limiting disability. Half of those 25 million are of working age, but of that half, less than 1/5 work part or full time. So it's a different side when we are thinking about workforce development, but that kind of possibility for autonomous vehicles to address equity in employment is also, I think, a really important one as we consider this space as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point to make. Megan, anything you'd add to this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I would just reiterate the point of interdisciplinary, the interdisciplinary nature of all of this. So I think the easiest example is one that Rodney lightly touched on. In advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity is obviously an increasingly important issue, but when you sort of conduct a formal landscape analysis of what sub-baccalaureate programs in advanced manufacturing are offering, the short answer is not a lot of cybersecurity. So as we're sort of rushing to train manufacturing technicians that can deal with advanced industrial robots and other sort of industrial 4.0 technologies, we're sort of missing a key piece there, the interdisciplinary piece, cybersecurity being a key example of that. I know that Rodney is working with a consortium of community colleges. I speak with various community colleges about this problem. So there's certainly some movement on this issue nationally and even with, say, the Ohio community colleges that I speak with. But there could definitely be more. And unfortunately, I hope it's not the case, but it might take another few serious cybersecurity incidents before people sort of really start to focus on this issue a bit more. The other piece I would like to emphasize is the emerging piece. So I think like autonomous vehicles, advanced manufacturing is very much emerging. There aren't a lot of codified programs in the US, although there are a growing number of such formal programs. These programs are doing a lot of really good things like threading soft skills or 21st century skills through their technical curriculum, providing student support services, trying to engage with employers, but there also remains a lot of work to be done in terms of just figuring out how to integrate employers more for work-based or work integrated experiences, which are really important for all students, but again, to pick up on an equity point, are particularly important for working adult learners or low-income learners who don't have the luxury of going to school going to a training program full-time and not working. In that respect, how does this sort of map on to today's specific discussion about credential transparency? With emerging and interdisciplinary dynamics in advanced manufacturing, I think transparency and data around data is going to be critical for understanding how individual working adult learners or other learners or institutions are sort of constructing these programs or constructing the plane while flying it. And then an important step that I think I, as a researcher, would be sort of remiss if I didn't mention is evaluating the efficacy of these different features and really starting to understand what's effective. In a recent RAND report, I shouldn't have been, but I was a bit shocked at how thin the literature is on workforce development, education, and training, and what works overall, and also for specific learner populations. So I sort of see Credential Engine and the partners here today as key in resolving that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so many different threads I want to pull from what each of you have just said. But I think thinking about how we get information into the hands of students and learners who are interested in your industries or interested in education and training to help them advance their careers. In the chat, Jillian Schulten from Indiana mentioned that there's been some discussions about pulling more data about the education and training related to cybersecurity from Indiana, from the registry into Cyberseek. And so that's one opportunity for helping make more transparent what are those opportunities and what do those credentials actually provide. So I'm curious, that's just one example, but curious about other things you're seeing maybe on the ground to help students and job seekers understand what their options are and maybe what you'd like to see in the future.
So we just finished a Cybersecurity Career Awareness Week, which we've been doing for 5 years now. And again, that's our first goal in our strategic plan, is to promote career discovery. And the word cybersecurity in and of itself is both a little scary and misleading. So earlier, when we were talking about autonomous vehicles, it made me think of a simplified way that the NIST framework can be used and interpreted. So we do certainly have roles that build products and services and solutions. And if that's what you like to do, you like to build things, and there's a career for you. And of course, our emphasis is on doing it securely. If you like to operate and maintain them, then there's lots of IT jobs, operational technology jobs, others. And as we heard, some of those things will operate themselves. So we don't necessarily need people, but that's certainly part of the future. But in cybersecurity, we also need people to defend, and people who, and the defense might come from training and awareness. It might just be, career awareness of all your employees, or making sure your employees have appropriate training, but it could be more technical in detecting, and even autonomous vehicles. You got to have people who's looking out for vulnerabilities or looking out for attacks or ways that they could be compromised. So there's a variety of different types of careers, and we need to continue to really break that down. And, just to take it back to Cyberseek, I know when we started with Cyberseek, our real intent was to get good data and to better connect kind of the community on what we're trying to define in terms of cybersecurity workforce. But the number of faculty and individuals who say, this is really a helpful way for me to explain career options. And by the way, in addition to the data about open jobs, there's a career pathway portal that takes you to specific job titles, what the pay is, what the requirements are, degrees, certifications. And again, as I said, you can even see by geography where those jobs are. So promoting careers and career discovery is going to be a big part of this, especially for young people, but also career changers.
I can touch on that a little bit, actually, just thinking about the young person career, answer this a little bit more personally. But, as a young professional, I knew I wanted to work in autonomous vehicles and spent a lot of time trying to figure out what path to get there. I'd always been interested in society and science and tech and how they come together, and knew I was really interested in transportation and autonomous vehicles as sort of this like big intersection of those. So I wasn't following the traditional computer science route. I was more interested in the policy, ethics, communication, education around it. So I wasn't following a clear blueprint. I had some great mentors. I had some great conversations, people who were willing in the industry to talk to me, but it wasn't crystallized. It wasn't set. And so, I'm personally really interested in seeing this area of the credentials, continue to develop and be more clear for that next generation of students, workers, the young professionals I get to talk to a lot who reach out to me and are like, hey, I'm really interested in this field. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do, and I think better credential data, having a database of those things to point to people, be like, oh, hey, I actually know this great resource. Like, here's a link I can send you. I think could really help kind of clarify and crystallize those sort of informal relationships and informal conversations that we're seeing as people are navigating it on a more individual level. And just really kind of try to get that in place to make sure that, again, we're collecting all of those different interdisciplinary fields and topics to make sure that we're adequately considering all of the different fields that will be intersected. So that's sort of my take on being a young professional in a field like this. It would be, I would love to be able to tell people who ask me who are in a similar boat, like, here's a way to do it. So.
Yeah, to pick up on that point, I put in the chat a couple of resources around advanced manufacturing with robotics and career models for that specific career, I guess, models for that specific career. They were developed by the ARM Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and its various partners. This is a freely available resource and serves as a good example, I think, of some of the emerging crystallized or solidified career pathways or career tools that different users, including not only job seekers, but community colleges or other education and training providers and employers as well, as they're starting to think about providing a transparent information about how someone gets from point A to point B in the career that they want. That being said, what I still think it's important for consortia like this one and other stakeholders to not stymie experimentation just because we do know very little about what works and what doesn't for different learner populations. So I guess I think I would like crystallization with experimentation. I mean, that would be my ideal, right? It's like having a consortium like this one where different stakeholders are experimenting with models at like a beta phase with a small number of learners, and then sort of gradually scaling up so that we can conduct different types of analyses and start to collect different points of evidence about what's working and what's not. And then as clear answers hopefully start to sort of again emerge, then you would have even more crystallization or solidification in those career pathways. So almost, I guess I would say, a continuous improvement model, right? Like, let's start, I think, starting with Credential Engine, getting the data in there, starting to sort of explore what different stakeholders are doing vis-a-vis their education and training offerings, as well as how learners are using them and the benefits to the different learner populations is a really great place to start. But it will come in phases. There will be continuous improvement, I hope.
Spoken like a true researcher.
I know, right? Or a manager.
Well, that's a really great, I think, sort of segue. One of the things that we've been talking about as a group through the MCTA is really not just defining and making transparent information about credentials, but also how do those credentials fit together into a pathway and trying to sort of understand what is the landscape of defined pathways in the region and within the states in the region, and within industries, and sort of realizing that obviously in some industries and in some places they're better defined than others for good reason. So I guess we've already talked a little bit about it, but what are you or your agency organization doing around pathways specifically, and maybe what could we do as the Midwestern Credential Transparency Alliance to help facilitate work that you see as important around pathways in your industry or just in general?
So I like to start with a definition of career pathways that we might all agree on. And since it's in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, we may not have a choice, but it's something that government's been working on together for a long time. But even having said that, I think it needs to be simplified. And I kind of say it in this way: it needs to be aligned with the skill needs of local and regional industries. So we need to look at what the employer demand is. Secondly, it needs to provide alternative learning pathways, which includes education, training, and workforce experiences. Thirdly, providing career coaching or career navigation to assist the learners that are traversing that pathway. Fourthly, encouraging the attainment of one or more credentials that document achievements. And then finally, helping individuals with career entry and career advancement. And part of the reason I like to emphasize the definition is NIST covers the gamut of that. A lot of people want to talk about, okay, once you get your first job, what's the next job? And that's really the last part of the definition. You know, we're thinking about how do we get those kids at an early, young age interested into a learning pathway, if you will. And then, of course, the key thing in the middle there is there's not one pathway, right? I mean, cybersecurity is great for that. I mean, you could graduate high school and enter into a cybersecurity career, community college, university. You could be working for 20 years in an entirely different field and then do a boot camp or a training program and enter into cybersecurity. You could be an apprentice, if you will. So I think that's what's really critical for us. And quite frankly, something we are doing on an ongoing basis is trying to kind of illuminate the multiple avenues, learning pathways, as well as career pathways to enter into cybersecurity.
I guess for autonomous vehicles, so in my direct work, I'm not working on defining pathways the same way that Rodney is to that extent. But you know, I do get to see and have conversations with a lot of people who are, and it's really neat. I mean, I think, again, getting back to sort of this interdisciplinary and who we're pulling for into these workforces and stuff, I just think there's a really important part of this work that can make sure that we're kind of bringing in voices of people who have been underserved by our current transportation system or could stand to really benefit from it in new ways, and bringing those voices to the table. So I think it's really beneficial when we think about an emerging technology like this one that's going to rely on innovation, is to have as many different people with different skill sets and ways of approaching these problems as possible. So I think, you know, this kind of intentional planning and regional focus on preparing workers and finding pathways for them for this kind of emerging technology, and making sure that those strengths that, you know, I think the Midwest is, you know, very well known for in the work industry perspective, and making sure that that perspective is brought to this field is just a really cool opportunity I see to work towards.
So I think there are two broad ways in which my work and others at RAND is directly related to promoting credential transparency, or just promoting, to go back to Rodney's definition of career pathway, just sort of this idea that across someone's life course, they're going to participate in a variety of education and program training opportunities that will coalesce in some sort of emergent way into their quote unquote career. So in a general sense, myself and my colleagues do a lot of research. We can call it fundamental research on sort of best practices for career pathways. So that can be anything from something I mentioned earlier, like work-based or work-integrated learning experiences. It can be something like a report I just put in the chat about stackable credentials in Ohio. It can be about student wraparound services, these sort of like fundamental building blocks that you have to have, that research suggests you have to have in place, whether it's for training for technicians in autonomous vehicles or advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, or basket weaving. Those just sort of all have to be there. I think more specifically for my area, advanced manufacturing and career pathways, we are doing a lot of work about barriers and facilitators for tech adoption in manufacturing. I think a lot of the headlines sort of pinpoint, suggest that there's this like massive shift to these very advanced industrial technologies, and it's creating this really acute shortage, labor shortage. And while that's partly true, some of that is just driven by like demographic transitions and retirements, the silver tsunami, if you will. And when you sit down and you talk to small to medium-sized employers in manufacturing in Pittsburgh and in other places, a lot of them tell you that given the uncertainty around the technology, return on investment, the rapid pace of innovation, they're sort of holding back. And so I think there's this potential disconnect in AM or advanced manufacturing where we're sort of like the technology is starting to get there and their employers are interested, and the number of programs offering this kind of training are increasing. But we need to get smaller to medium-sized employers on board to sort of like connect and really reach the full sort of dynamic potential of that sector. So I guess I'll leave it at that in terms of like actual work. I will add a third category, which is actual work I would like to do. So to kind of go back to my point about matching supply and demand for labor and some points that Rodney had made earlier, and points about equity, I sort of, given the rapid pace of innovation, a question that I have about career pathways is, are we building career pathways that are going to be robust across a given individual's working career? So if we're taking the example that Tabitha gave earlier, someone coming just into the workforce who's training in an advanced manufacturing program, it's plausible that given technological change midway through their career, they could be facing significant shifts or unemployment in their work, like in their career. And that is, I think, speaking to a Midwest consortium, is something that we have seen before and we would like to avoid again. And I think that's something that we want to keep an eye on. And who knows, I think credential data, Credential Engine will be helpful for that.
Yeah, you keep giving me such perfect transitions to sort of next threads that I want to pull on. So I appreciate that. Because one of the things that I've been thinking throughout this conversation is how do we sort of set ourselves up as a society for whatever the future of work means. I mean, we talk about the future of work a lot in different groups, I'm sure. And something that I think also likely comes up in all of these conversations is translating skills from education and training to job skills, and whether there is a mismatch or whether people are just not speaking the same language to each other, and whether those skills can be transferable across careers or across occupations or across somebody's lifetime. So I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to, what is the role of employers in helping make sure that education and training is meeting their skills needs? How do we make sure that people are speaking the same language about skills? I think we like to think that credential transparency can help solve that problem, and sort of having a more clear and defined language to speak about those things, but would love thoughts on that. deep in thought.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things we're attempting to do with the NICE framework. I mean, we have what we call building blocks, which talks about tasks, the work that's to be done that employers need done, and then the knowledge and skills that support the task. We also have them roll up into work roles so that, like, the NICE framework has 52 different work roles that employers can use. And this is all kind of driven by employers and subject matter experts. What we're doing now, and this is all part of the vocabulary discussion, is adding competencies. And for us, competencies more describes the learner. So it's the knowledge and skills that the learner brings to the table. So to your point about mismatch, that is a big concern of mine, because, you know, the big buzzword right now, in fact, we have a government executive order that says we're going to hire based on skills and competencies. And so we have employers across the federal government racing to develop assessments to assess that the job candidate has skills and competencies. And at the same time, we have all these credential providers that have been training and certifying and providing some kind of credential that says, yeah, I give them an associate's degree, an undergraduate degree, a certification, a badge, or whatever the credential might be, because we think they have met that. So it's a disconnect. And of course, that's our goal, is to try to bring those communities closer together. So there's more of an integrated ecosystem and an interdependency. That doesn't mean that one doesn't trust the other. And there is a lot of mistrust right now. And part of that, from an academic perspective, is our own fault. You know, a lot of emphasis on knowledge and theory, not skills and hands-on learning and practical things that employers need. So we need to change that paradigm and the language, quite frankly, but we also need employers to both be more engaged with the educational system, but also trust it more.
So I think Rodney has made some really important points about many things, Rodney, but in this particular instance, employer engagements. I think we put a lot of tools and data out there. We have less understanding around how they're actually used, whether that's by the individual student or the employer, et cetera. And so that might be a particular instance in which intermediary organizations are particularly important. So manufacturing extension programs out of Rodney's agency, NIST, the ARM Institute that I flagged earlier, which is federally funded. It's one of many federally funded centers around the country focused on particular areas within advanced manufacturing. These sort of intermediary organizations, I think, are critical for, like, applying the frameworks and collecting the data and using the tools that we would like to see used with particularly small to medium-sized employers. And I will beat that drum loudly many times throughout this panel, just because I feel like a lot of the case studies that we see, or a lot of the headlines that we read, are about the Amazons or the GEs or Black & Decker, what have you, these larger firms that have resources, a variety of resources that smaller to medium-sized employers do not. Even though, at least in the case of advanced manufacturing, small to medium-sized employers make up the lion's share of the sector. And so just sort of engaging with them. And I think it's going to take sort of like boots on the ground work. I've spoken to, like, local chambers of commerce, employers, different intermediary organizations in my field, in my area. And a lot of them say, yeah, we sent out an employer survey and we got like a 30% response rate. So a survey is not going to cut it. There has to be, like, concerted human and other resources around engaging, interviewing, talking to these employers, going to their businesses, and just really a lot of campaigning, if you will.
Yeah, great points.
I like that idea of, talking to the employers who are engaged in this work. I think thinking about Rodney's point to mismatching, and then Megan's point earlier about, as innovation is happening rapidly and companies are trying to decide what to do and what skills are necessary and how to train. One thing I've seen in this space, for autonomous trucking especially is how startups are kind of approaching those skills and using the workforce and the skills that people have already developed in this field and taking that to look forward to the future, a future that's not entirely sure. Nobody has the exact answer yet on what autonomous vehicles are going to look like or how exactly they're going to be interfered in society. But I think when you're talking about something, this new flashy technology that's so innovative, trying to make sure that you're not just like burning everything to the ground from the past. And so, I was part of a panel earlier this year my group hosted that was on what do AVs mean for the workforce. And we got to speak with somebody who's in the startup space in autonomous trucking, but he talked a lot about that concern of displacement and how much we kind of see that when, especially industries that are affected by increases in automation and is often referred to with truck drivers. And he made some really good points about the work that their company is doing right now to employ drivers who have decades of experience and using that experience that they have to create their development and testing process right now. It's of course something that we need to keep an eye on and be aware of and be very intentional about building that, as Megan said, but it's an interesting, I think, piece to think about what sort of some of the leaders in the space and the people who, to the extent that it's a very new field, but have been doing this for even a couple years, can, I think, give us really interesting sort of anecdotal and stories and sort of storytelling of what they've seen as they start to shape those workforces that hopefully, like Megan's saying, if we can capture and hear what they're saying and then figure out in the future what that means we should be thinking about as we tell students or people in their mid-careers how they can prepare for that future.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a couple questions in the chat. Josh, I'm not ignoring your question about who's creating pathways, but I think Jeff is going to speak a lot to what we've found in some of our research in just a few minutes. So I'm not ignoring it, but we will get to it. But there's a couple of questions in the chat about how occupational licenses might fit into your industry and into your work, and whether you're thinking about or working with state licensing boards. Rodney, you put something in the chat, but I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so it's a 2013 National Academies report that kind of asks the question is, should the cybersecurity profession be professionalized, which translates into licenses or some kind of professional structure overseeing the people that do the work. And at the time, a group of academics concluded it's not quite mature enough. And I think that was probably a fair assessment back in 2013. But just with my example of 52 work roles, I think until we wait until the entire profession is ready, there could be some segments of cybersecurity work that is ready or that's so critical. I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. Somebody who does penetration testing or vulnerability assessment for organizations, and that's done quite often by contractors and third parties, you might want to have them come in with some kind of a professional license or third party, maybe something more than the certifications that are available right now to attest to their not only skills 3 years ago at the time of the certification, but their ongoing, continuing education and professional development. And the other example is cybersecurity analyst. This is the person that's, on a day-to-day basis, making sure that autonomous vehicle is not going to crash, or making sure your industrial control system is not going to crash, or whatever the case may be. You may actually want to start looking at segments of the profession and say, hey, yeah, licenses here might be appropriate and quite frankly, might be related to insurance.
Yeah, to build on Rodney's point, and also my first reaction when I saw that comment in the chat was that of the three fields we're considering today on the panel, specifically, cybersecurity would be most likely to be ready, and it's not ready, according to our expert on the panel. So I think that's all to say that advanced manufacturing is also not ready. It may well be, as Rodney is saying, for specific machining positions or tasks, or other sort of technical tasks. But I think in terms of a series of licenses such that you complete them, you are a certified advanced manufacturing robotics technician, I don't think the field is ready yet. And I guess I would say, back to an earlier point that I made, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it is sort of early stages for advanced manufacturing in many respects. we might want to see among Midwestern states or other regions in the US or abroad even, what sort of happens with different occupational licenses or certifications and associated career pathways. And so that we can sort of, again, follow that continuous improvement model such that we're being as efficient and equitable as possible.
I think Rodney and Megan said everything I could have said and are far better experts on that exact topic. So I'll leave it to them.
All right. Well, that I think is time for this panel. So just wanted to thank the three of you again for all of your knowledge and expertise. I definitely enjoyed listening to the conversation, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. So thank you so much. And I will turn it over, I believe, to Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Bye.
Yeah, thanks everyone. My goodness, that was exciting to hear about all the developments and think about how our work might all connect in with these emerging pathways. So let me share my screen just because I think we did want to pivot to some updates for the group about pathway development work. So let's see here. I think that is sharing my screen now. And I know just to get us started, maybe to say that Credential Engine has been following up on all of the good guidance we've gotten from our pathway action teams along the way, and this group since our last quarterly. In particular, the guidance on Josh's question around, well, who are the people that are creating these pathways? What are their roles? How are they trained? What are the resources and supports that they receive? I think that's going to be a pretty fruitful area for us to lean into. We don't have any results to present right now, but there is groups that can help us. We put in a research request to the National Labor Exchange. It's a NLX resource that makes available to researchers structured data about job descriptions across America. And so one of the tactics here is to look at which job descriptions call out career pathways as part of their responsibilities. And what are the qualifications of those people? What are their titles? What kind of inferences can we glean from that kind of bottom-up work? And we've also had several states connect us with people that are already actively involved in authoring career pathways. And I'd say those contacts have been more from official Department of Ed agencies involved, with career technical education pathways, that kind of work. But we know this happens at many levels, including at institutions. And some of our good participants here are also actively involved in pathway creation. So I think we've got a lot to learn still in support of accelerating publishing pathways. And that is kind of the framing here for updates. I thought we could just see if folks have any updates on the pathway work that they're doing that they'd like to share. Feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, or just come off mute. Mark Lupa, yes, please.
Hi, Jeff, and congratulations on the program. And there was really a fascinating panel. Good to see everyone. I'm with IMS Global, and I'm happy to say that we are working actively to develop an open standard to incorporate these pathways into digital credentials, whether they be badges or comprehensive learning records or learning and employment records, however you want to term them. And we're working closely with Credential Engine and others to make sure that the open standard is fully supportive of all of the different ways to consider pathways. So just wanted to let you know that there is an open standard that's being developed and will be supportive of the credential registry's implementation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. These tools that we use are so much more helpful if they're connected to one another. So that's very encouraging. Great. Any other updates, maybe from state partners. I know I'll just share that I had a good call this week with folks in Ohio about some of the pathways that were identified as part of our research, and some follow-up conversations around an initiative called Drive Ohio, which Tabitha, you may have actually connected me with, but there's,
I think I did.
yeah, so that was super helpful because they are similarly involved in some workforce development planning and have some very high level models for pathways. But I think as that matures, we can have it in the registry as well. We're not seeing any hands up. Maybe I'll just iterate through a couple more quick updates. We do want to save time too for some breakouts, but I do know that the North Dakota work continues. We had some good focal meetings on that work with Bismarck State College and with University of North Dakota on their cybersecurity pathways, and hope to have some production level implementations, well, some examples to share next time we meet. And I know there's good work in Ohio about community colleges and having their credentials published, and some existing work with incarcerated populations and the outcomes associated with those, with that work, as well as connections with industry certifications. So there's a pathway opportunity there in Ohio. Josh, thanks for raising your hand. I'd appreciate any updates you want to share.
Yeah, so with regard to the North Dakota cybersecurity pathways, we are trying to align the micro-credentials and credentials to the course objectives and program objectives, both at UND and at Bismarck State. But interestingly, those objectives do not in any way align with the NIST framework, but maybe should. So we do have a case version of the NIST framework we can use to enable alignments to those course objectives and those micro-credential objectives, but the institutions haven't articulated those alignments. So that's part of the challenge, is how do we all speak a common language about cybersecurity skills, knowledge, abilities, and tasks.
I'm so glad you highlighted that, Josh. It's intellectually challenging work, often for faculty as well as staff. And the frameworks we're dealing with are not superficial. They are the NIST framework is very detailed, actually, in all its specifications. So if we can learn from that alignment work and highlight the roles and the skills needed to do that competency crosswalk, I think that could be very helpful for everybody.
Right, and to the same point, we created a case version of the NIST framework and elaborated with the IQ4 line competencies, but that's our identifiers in North Dakota for the NIST framework. It would be really helpful if NIST were to publish a case version as a canonical reference that we can all align to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some technical parts of that and intellectual parts. So, Josh, I appreciate sharing and highlighting those elements. It's kind of the whole point, I think, of these collaborating and sharing then across state lines about progress that's being made. So, more to come, I think. Seeing some good activity in the chat too. So if anyone wants to chime in on anything we were just talking about, please do. But I do know that Indiana has been actively involved with Credential Engine as well. And we'd shared in an earlier meeting around the TSAP pathways. I understand there's additional development being done there so that the pathways can support a variety of relationships. It's not just that one thing is required to connect to another, but that you could have elements that are connected through a suggested sequence. One item might precede another, there could be intended progression levels. And so that's and another layer of pathways is not just what are the connections, but how do you describe those connections? So learners can benefit and come in at multiple points on a pathway. All of this work is sort of around accelerating pathways. And we also have committed to interstate pathway connections. I did want to share that the College Board did publish their 28 AP exams now to the registry. So many states offer credit for completing AP exams at certain levels, and that information can be captured as a transfer value profile and also referenced via pathways. So I encourage you to check that out. We do have a new pathway from the National Retail Foundation in the credential finder for you to look at, and lots of activity around cybersecurity, autonomous vehicles. I think still developing more to come, probably meetings in early January on cybersecurity and autonomous vehicles to come. Our incarcerated work has been a little slower, I'd say. We've done a lot of desk research or bench research, but we would love to have more partners help us identify opportunities to serve incarcerated populations. And so we'll continue to explore the leads that have been identified here, but could use your help as well. And the last item I wanted to highlight from our brief is our action item number 4 around technical requirements for pathways, and that can span many different areas, either authoring or displaying pathways. And we've had some good connections in Indiana with some of their plans around pathway procurement technology. And then just recently in Texas, there's an open request for, it's like a request for proposal. They call it something else, but related to programming that can incorporate in pathways, pathway tools. So we'll learn from that and try to work towards identifying requirements that all states in the Midwest at least could endorse and lead to some of our procurement goals. Oh goodness, so I ended up sharing more details as part of that update than I intended. I appreciate Mark and Josh, both of your contributions too about the good partnerships with IMS. So look forward to moving that forward. Any other updates for the good of the group before we switch to breakouts? Yeah, a link for the Texas RFP. Yeah. Let me just put that in the chat. So yeah, feel free to check that out. They, have some language related to their requirements for what they're looking for and the criteria they'll use for evaluating proposals here. It's very illustrative of the type of language that we'll want to be getting discussions around and getting to more engagement with this group next year. Okay, well, not hearing anything else, maybe I will switch back. Let's see, I am sharing my screen. So we are going to switch to breakout sessions. Our 5th item on our brief was to highlight opportunities for supportive state policies for pathways. And maybe the way to think about this is that many other elements of our credentialing ecosystem have either highly developed practices or very specific guiding policies that could influence the outputs and of institutions' work and set expectations about what employers can expect from credentials. I think about, at the most extreme end, in my mind, we have a federal FERPA regulation around records, access to those. There's a whole professional training with registrars, and a lot of business rules follow from that level of policy. I'm not saying that that's what we need in pathways, but at maybe the far other end, you have instructor practices inside classes related to grading or other instructional activities, which are intentional but aren't governed by at the same level of detail and guidance. But there are support services for those activities, and I think Pathways is operating maybe at a variety of levels in different states. But what would be really helpful for us is to hear from you about related policy, and or if not policy, even just assume practices that have been effective in your state related to pathways. We'd like to identify those, talk about them in breakouts, and then share with the group to sort of start framing up what are some of the things we might do as a region related to pathway policy. Okay. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe ask Annika to help me figure out the Zoom steps.
Yep, I'm all set to move folks into breakout rooms. So I'm going to hit the button on that soon. Did you want to share the link to the Padlet before we begin?
Yes, I did. We have prepared a Padlet that I will put in the chat here. And, the questions, just to tee it up again, is to, in each breakout, please contribute the questions here. Say, what policies do you have in place now in support of pathways? And if you don't know or have policies in place, what could be in place to help facilitate and support this work? And so really, we're trying to capture everyone's current state, and I'd appreciate all contributions that you're willing to share in the Padlet.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms now. You should receive a request to move. If anyone has any trouble, I'll be here to help.
With supporting college to 2-year to 4-year pathway programs is learners credits, potential credits often fall between the cracks because those pathway agreements are on paper versus hardwired in the registrar's office.
Right.
And then another thing that we've really experienced is the ability of a community college to know who's chosen, what students are enrolled in, have chosen a pathway. Are they enrolled? Are they stopping out, and not completing at the 2-year program, and or do they complete, and are they then given all the credits due for the 4-year? And so it ties into both infrastructure from systems and data, but also things like advisement and pathway success. So
Totally. I hate we didn't have more time, but that's a rich opportunity for outcomes as well, reporting. I'm going to have to hand the ball over to Emily for a report out from their group.
Yeah, we had a great conversation, and you can check out a lot of the examples that are on the Padlet. I think my biggest takeaway from the conversation was that a lot of states have a lot of policies and practice that's sort of well documented to support transfer for things that I think have been happening for a long time. So from community college to 4-year institutions, and also emerging things like in Ohio, they're starting to develop policies for providing credit for industry recognized credentials. So I think those types of policies are a little bit easier to see and find and more ubiquitous in states. And what we talked about as being a little bit less ubiquitous is policies for pathways more broadly. And Marty in Kansas made the great point that that is often very dependent on workforce needs at the regional level. And so the reason that there might not be statewide policies for that is because there's it's harder to develop pathways at the state level that are specific to workforce needs on the ground. But yeah, those are my takeaways. Anybody else from my breakout want to chime in on anything that I missed? Okay, well, I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Emily. One of the things that our group discussed and I thought was very interesting were how we're going to reconcile our current status with the new pathways. How do we approach this process? Who's involved in this process? And the importance of getting with the business community to create this framework that both the workforce and higher ed can utilize to make sure these pathways are getting across. We also talked about the michigantransfer.org. They have pathways for their community college credits to transfer to the four-year institutions. And this was something that was definitely driven by legislators. Anybody else from our group have something to they want to share?
Well, this is Mark. I've put in the chat the fact that we have a funded project from Walmart and the Charles Koch Foundation called the Wellspring Initiative. And the principles behind it are to do demonstration projects to show the use of open standards in practice to do exactly this, to bridge education to work. And so this year we brought together 8 institutions to collaborate with their employer partners to together define programs. So academic programs, and they could be very small, also not for credit, or larger and for credit, that align with particular job qualifications that were also published in a framework. And these frameworks are connected together using linked data and really consumable by the credential registry. And we learned a lot. This is very early days in this process. And of this learning, we're going to be publishing in case studies that will be coming out in the next few weeks. But we're going to be unveiling the results and actually having a roundtable of the participants at our upcoming Digital Credentials Summit, which is February 28th in Atlanta. So there's lots to be learned in this space. We don't yet have a quote unquote open standard for pathways, but we are continually trying to learn what they should be based on practical examples that we are trying to organize and operate.
Thanks, Mark. And I will pass it over to Rohit.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, our group had a really good conversation around transfer pathways and articulation agreements and sort of leveraging a more collaborative approach as opposed to a legislative approach. And I'm going to let Crystal and Dee Dee talk about some of the work that's going on in Wisconsin and Michigan as they're the experts. So Crystal, do you want to talk a little bit about what we discussed?
Sure, thanks. So I'm Crystal. I'm with the Wisconsin Technical College System in Wisconsin, and we really consider our system a guided career pathway system. We are focused on getting students ready for specific occupational careers and also pathways that go beyond the first job. So we have really robust articulation agreements across the state to ensure there's pathways for students beyond their first career, and have emphasized having short-term credentials in our system. It's 2 to 30 credit technical diplomas that allow students to start working right away and then come back in to move down the path of their academic career to get associate's degrees and on to 4-year, where it's where it's warranted. We do have some legislative work on transfer to, we have 72 credits of guaranteed universal credit transfer between our 2-year and 4-year partners, and some state work that's embedded in some national work with the JFF Student Success Center Network. And there's a link in the chat about the work our K-12 system is doing on regional career pathways and has really worked closely with industry. There's links in my comment in the chat, in the Padlet. Go ahead, Dee Dee.
Awesome, thank you so much. Definitely a lot of great conversation with our group. We did find that we have some similarities. So we have the 60 by 30 initiative in Michigan, really focused on that degree or career attainment. Wisconsin has a 60 forward. So it was kind of interesting for us to learn from each other, you know, how those things are similar. We did talk a lot about the fact that Michigan we're not legislated to do a lot of things as it relates to these pathway initiatives. However, we do have a lot of systems in place and things that are driven by legislators, as you heard earlier from Sarah's group. So the My Transfer Pathway Initiative, which we took 12 pathways and looked to see how do we build on that 30-hour gen ed block for the Michigan Transfer Agreement. And that's been really successful. There's some more work going on as well in the pathway initiatives focused on workforce development and some other areas that are underway right now. We do have a lot of great collaboration, not always quite where we want it, but between the community colleges, the universities, the public community colleges, public universities, and the independents to build on some of this pathway initiative work. So while we're not legislated in a lot of these areas, we do have a lot of work going on in the state to support this type of work. And I think that kind of wraps up ours.
Okay. Thanks, Dee Dee. Turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks everyone. I think we're at our time. I just want to close with a plug for our state convening coming up November 30th. If you can register via the link, and I hope you can join us. We've got a great set of panelists and discussions to continue about the role of states and policy and leaders and advancing credential transparency broadly in many different ways. So this group, I think this is our last meeting of the year, but then what we'll do is reconvene, I believe in February, and then we are hoping to schedule some more focused meetings about pathways earlier in January, probably a cybersecurity and autonomous vehicle one, if not more. So thank you all for all your contributions and help. It's really appreciated. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.